a flight to remember. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow across the tarmac of the airport. Inside the luxurious terminal, Marcus Evans sat in a plush leather chair, his attention divided between the quiet hum of the airport and his 10-year-old son, Jaden. They were about to embark on a special journey, one that Marcus had planned for months, a trip to Paris to visit Jaden's mother, Sophia, who had been away on business. It was a rare opportunity for father and son to spend quality time together, away from the constant whirlwind of Marcus's business responsibilities. As they boarded the private jet that Marcus owned, Jaden's eyes widened with excitement. His father had always been a mystery to him, a figure of strength and authority, and now they were stepping into a world that Jaden could only dream of. The private suite aboard the plane was everything Jaden had imagined, a small, intimate room filled with rich wood accents, soft leather seats, and plush carpeting. A window beside them offered a perfect view of the sprawling airport below, and Jaden pressed his face to the glass, watching as the plane began its journey down the runway. Marcus, however, was less focused on the grandeur of the surroundings. He had been in this world for years, the world of business, private jets, and corporate deals, but what mattered to him most was this moment with his son. He had spent so many years working tirelessly, trying to grow his airline empire, but in doing so, he had missed precious time with Jaden. The guilt weighed heavily on his heart. "You know, Jaden," Marcus began, his deep voice calm yet warm, "I can't tell you how happy I am that we're finally taking this trip together." He shifted in his seat, adjusting his perfectly pressed suit as he turned to face his son. "The plane is amazing, right?" he continued, smiling as he watched his son's face light up. "But you know what's even more amazing? That we're finally going to see your mom after all this time." Jaden's smile widened as he sipped the fresh orange juice a flight attendant had just brought them. "I can't believe you own all of this, Dad," he said, his voice filled with awe. Marcus chuckled, his eyes softening. "It's amazing, son. But there's something even more amazing. We're finally going to spend time together. I've been away so much for work lately, but I promise, from now on, things are going to change." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Family comes first. Always." The words resonated deeply within Jaden. Despite the luxurious surroundings, what mattered most to him was the bond he shared with his father. He nodded earnestly. "Really?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. "Really," Marcus affirmed, his tone firm with conviction. "I've been thinking about this a lot. We're going to make time for each other. No more work coming between us." He smiled, reaching over to place a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You and your mom mean the world to me, Jaden. And I won't let anything get in the way of that." The sound of the jet engines grew louder as the plane began its ascent into the sky. Jaden settled back into his seat, comforted by his father's words, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling of excitement about the adventure ahead. The future seemed full of possibilities, especially with his family together again. Hours passed, and the jet soared smoothly through the sky. Jaden leaned against the window, his thoughts drifting. He had always been a quiet boy, not one to complain or make a fuss, but today felt different. Today was special. His dad was right beside him, and soon they would be reunited with his mother. He could hardly wait to show her the souvenirs they had picked up along the way, the small trinkets from Paris that would be a reminder of their trip. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a quiet unease began to bubble within him. He shifted in his seat and stretched his legs, his gaze wandering across the cabin. The flight attendant, a woman named Emily, was moving up and down the aisle, delivering drinks and snacks to the passengers. Jaden had noticed her earlier. She had smiled at him and his father when they boarded, but something about her eyes had seemed distant, almost cold. Jaden's stomach churned slightly. He had always been taught to be polite and respectful, especially when he was representing his family. His parents had raised him to be kind to everyone, regardless of their background or appearance. Yet, something about the flight attendant made him feel uneasy, though he couldn't put his finger on why. As the flight progressed, Jaden decided to stretch his legs. He unbuckled his seatbelt and walked down the aisle, careful to mind his manners as he passed passengers in their seats. He nodded to the elderly couple sitting across the aisle, who smiled warmly at him. As he continued his journey to the bathroom, he noticed a few more passengers, some reading, others lost in conversation. The gentle sway of the plane barely registered in his mind as he took in the details of the cabin. His brief journey through it had already become an adventure in its own right. After using the bathroom, Jaden walked back toward the front of the plane. As he passed the refreshment station, he grabbed a glass of water from the flight attendant, who handed it to him with a forced smile. Jaden's eyes lingered on her for a moment, feeling the odd tension that hung in the air. But before he could ask if everything was okay, he turned and began to walk back to his seat. Suddenly, the plane hit a small patch of turbulence. It wasn't enough to be dangerous, but it was enough to throw off Jaden's balance. He stumbled forward, his glass of water sloshing over the rim and splashing onto the flight attendant's uniform. The woman's face immediately contorted with frustration. Her eyes flickered over her now damp uniform, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Watch where you're going," she snapped, her tone sharp and cold. Jaden immediately started apologizing, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Can I help clean it up?" The flight attendant, Emily, seemed to barely acknowledge his words, instead focusing on wiping away the water with a napkin. Her posture was stiff, and Jaden could sense her annoyance, though she tried to mask it behind a thin veneer of professionalism. But the tension in the air was palpable, and Jaden's heart began to race as he realized that the woman wasn't just upset about the accident, there was something more to it. Despite his best attempts to make things right, Emily's response was curt. "It's fine," she said, her voice low and cold. But as she dabbed at her uniform, she muttered something under her breath, her words barely audible to Jaden. Feeling the discomfort in the air, Jaden quickly excused himself and began to walk back to his seat. But as he moved past her, Emily's gaze followed him, her eyes narrowing with disdain. What had just happened? Unbeknownst to him, this seemingly small incident would soon escalate into something far more significant, an event that would change not only Jaden's life but also the course of the flight attendant's career. The unraveling of prejudice. The jet glided through the air as Marcus Evans sat back in his business class suite, his mind preoccupied with the events of the day. His thoughts meandered between the high-flying corporate world that had built his family's life and the crushing reality of what his son had just endured. The gentle hum of the engines, the calming cadence of the flight attendants moving through the aisles, and the distant chattering of fellow passengers felt like the soundtrack to a scene that was too unreal. He had always prided himself on his work, his empire, and the way he had raised Jaden to be kind, strong, and respectful. But now, seeing his son's troubled face flash before him, he couldn't shake the sense of betrayal and heartbreak that lingered. Jaden, his young son, had walked into the plane's aisle like any child, with curiosity and wonder. That was all it took to spark a chain of events that would change both their lives. Marcus clenched his jaw as he remembered how Jaden had stood there, in the midst of an unnecessary confrontation, a young boy who had done nothing more than spill a drink by accident. And yet, he was met with words so vile, words that carried the weight of an age-old prejudice, fueled by assumptions about his race. The flight attendant, Emily Carter, had been cold at first, even rude, dismissing Jaden's apology and intentionally avoiding him. But when Jaden tried to right his wrong, offering help and apologizing again, Emily escalated things to a level that shocked everyone, herself included. Racial slurs, a slap, and the cruel handling of a child who was only guilty of existing in the space she deemed unworthy. No apology, no remorse, just a steady stream of hate wrapped in the guise of superiority. Marcus's mind raced. The moment he saw Jaden's face, confused, hurt, and on the verge of tears, he felt his heart break. He had heard stories of such prejudice before, but never did he imagine it would touch his own child. A 10-year-old boy, with no understanding of the hatred that could exist in the world, had been reduced to an object of ridicule simply because of his skin color. And yet, it wasn't even the cruel words or the slap that made Marcus's blood boil. It was the fact that Emily's actions were so casual, so ingrained in her beliefs, that she didn't even hesitate before treating Jaden this way. Marcus stood up from his seat, his anger palpable. He had raised Jaden with love and care, teaching him to be polite and respectful to everyone, regardless of their background. And now, Jaden had been humiliated by someone who saw him not as a young child, full of potential, but as someone less than human, a child who didn't belong in a space of luxury. As he approached the cabin's aisle, Marcus couldn't help but feel the full weight of the situation. He could see the subtle expressions on the faces of the other passengers, some of them aware, some of them pretending not to notice. But none of them stepping in to intervene. It was as if they had all grown accustomed to the inequality in the world and had resigned themselves to its existence. But not Marcus. Not anymore. Let him go. Marcus's voice was steady, commanding, as he approached Emily, his gaze never leaving her face. There was no anger in his voice, but the authority was unmistakable. Emily froze. Her face drained of color as she turned to face the man whose presence seemed to fill the entire cabin. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a father stepping in to protect his son. This was the owner of the airline, Marcus Evans himself. The grip on Jaden's wrist slackened, and Jaden quickly pulled his arm away, walking back to the safety of their suite without looking back. Emily's face contorted with disbelief. She had no idea that the quiet, well-mannered boy she had berated and humiliated was the son of the airline's owner. All of her prior arrogance and false confidence had shattered in an instant. "Mr. Evans, I didn't realize," she stammered, her words struggling to escape her lips. Her earlier venom had evaporated, leaving nothing but a pitiful attempt at justification. But Marcus wasn't interested in her excuses. "Do not speak," Marcus interrupted, his tone low but final. "Your actions speak for themselves." The other flight attendants, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to shuffle nervously. They were well aware of who Marcus Evans was, the billionaire CEO who had built his empire from the ground up. The weight of his presence in the cabin now hung heavily in the air. The quiet murmurs of passengers turned to whispers as they began to piece together what had just happened. But none of them, not a single one, dared to intervene when Emily had crossed the line with Jaden. Marcus wasn't going to let that slide. "Emily, this is your last flight with us," Marcus said, his voice now laced with a cold finality that left no room for negotiation. "When we land, you will report to the lead attendant. Your services are no longer required." For the first time, Emily's mask of professionalism crumbled completely. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She had never expected such a consequence. How could she have? Her sense of entitlement, her belief that she was above reproach, had blinded her to the realities of the world she lived in. Marcus was a man of principle, and the behavior she had displayed was inexcusable. His eyes narrowed as he stared at her, his voice low but unwavering. "You've made a grievous mistake today, Emily. One that will have consequences. Your treatment of my son will not go unpunished." With one last look of contempt, Marcus turned on his heel and walked back to their private suite, where Jaden was waiting. Emily's steps faltered as she watched him leave. Her confidence, once so bold, was now shattered beyond repair. She had treated a child with cruelty, and it had cost her everything. The shame was palpable, but it was too late to turn back. Her actions had sealed her fate. Jaden sat quietly in their suite, his small hands folded in his lap. He was trying to make sense of what had happened, but the confusion lingered in his eyes. He wasn't sure what had just unfolded, but the kindness he had offered, the politeness he had displayed, had been met with something far darker than he had ever imagined. He had always been taught to be respectful, to show kindness to others, but Emily hadn't seen him as a child. She had seen him only for his skin color. "Jaden," Marcus's voice was soft as he entered the suite, his face etched with concern. He knelt down in front of his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Jaden nodded slowly, blinking back tears. "I don't understand, Dad. Why did she treat me like that? I didn't do anything wrong." Marcus's heart broke at his son's words. How could a child, at such a young age, already understand the sting of prejudice and cruelty? I know, son. I know. He pulled Jaden into a tight hug, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on him. He had done his best to shield Jaden from the harsh realities of the world, but today, he had been forced to confront them head-on. I'm so proud of you, Marcus whispered, stroking Jaden's hair. You handled that better than anyone could have expected. You didn't let her words hurt you. You didn't let her hate define you. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Jaden looked up at his father, his eyes wide. What will happen to her, Dad? Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure what the right answer was. The world didn't always offer neat resolutions, and not everyone was going to face the consequences of their actions. But for Jaden, Marcus knew that this moment had to become a lesson, not just for Emily, but for his son as well. She will face the consequences of her actions, Jaden. But remember, son, it's not about making her suffer. It's about making sure she understands why what she did was wrong. She needs to learn, just like we all do. And sometimes, learning comes in the form of a hard lesson. Jaden nodded solemnly, his small face thoughtful. He was beginning to understand, though the complexity of the world's unfairness still puzzled him. For now, he could only hope that the actions of those around him would one day match the lessons he had learned in his young life. As the plane descended toward its final destination, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what would become of Emily. The truth was, he didn't care about her future as much as he cared about ensuring Jaden's future was one free from hate. The next steps would not be easy, but Marcus was ready to fight for that, for his son's peace of mind, for his family's integrity. He would make sure that Jaden grew up knowing that standing up against injustice was the only way to make the world better for everyone. The awakening of courage. The following days were a blur of meetings, calls, and paperwork for Marcus. The jet had landed in New York, and the initial shock of the incident began to settle into a more determined resolve. Marcus had made sure that Emily Carter's departure from the airline was swift and decisive. But what lingered longer in his mind was how he could use this moment, this painful chapter, to spark change, not just for Jaden, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of prejudice. It wasn't enough to punish Emily. That would be too simple, too easy. Marcus wanted something deeper, something that would resonate, something that would open eyes, break down barriers, and bring about the kind of systemic change that would protect children like Jaden from ever having to face such hate again. But as the days passed, a new feeling began to surface in him. Guilt. He had been so focused on protecting his son, on dealing with the immediate fallout of Emily's actions, that he hadn't taken the time to really check in with Jaden. To see how this had affected him beyond the surface level. Late one night, as the lights of the city outside flickered through the windows, Marcus sat down in the living room, his mind still racing with ideas. He looked up when he heard footsteps approaching. It was Jaden, standing hesitantly at the doorframe, his face a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Dad? Jaden's voice was small, almost uncertain. It was the kind of voice a child uses when they have something they want to ask but aren't sure how to. Marcus smiled warmly and patted the seat next to him. Hey, buddy. Come sit down. Jaden stepped forward, a little slower than usual, his hands clasped together as if he were still holding on to something. He sat down next to his father, but there was a distance in his posture, an invisible wall between them. I've been thinking, Marcus began, trying to ease the tension, about how I can make things right after what happened on the plane. You know, how we can turn this into something meaningful. Something that helps not just you, but others too. Jaden nodded slowly, but his eyes remained distant. I don't know, Dad. I don't think I really care about that stuff. I just want it to stop, you know? It's not just her. It's like people always look at me like I'm not supposed to be here. Like I'm different, or not enough. Marcus's heart tightened. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from Jaden made the gravity of the situation all the more real. Jaden, at only 10 years old, was already beginning to internalize the cruelty of the world, to feel the weight of judgment on his shoulders. Marcus had tried so hard to shield him from this very thing, but the truth was undeniable now. This wasn't just one encounter with an ignorant flight attendant. This was a deeper issue, one that Jaden would undoubtedly face time and time again. It was the insidiousness of prejudice, how it permeated every part of society, from the smallest interactions to the grandest systems. It was something that would follow him as he grew older, unless someone like Marcus, decided to stand up and make sure it didn't. "Son," Marcus said, his voice soft but steady, "I want you to know something. What happened to you? That was not your fault. It was never your fault. But I also want you to understand that this isn't just something that happens to you. It happens to other people too, people who look like you, people who are different. And sometimes, we have to speak up. Not just for ourselves, but for others too." Jaden turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto his father's. "But why? Why do we have to fight all the time? Why can't people just see us? See me?" His voice cracked, and for the first time, Marcus saw the weight of the situation truly reflected in his son's face. It wasn't just about one moment. It wasn't just about the slap or the words. It was about the internal battle Jaden was beginning to face every day. The fight to simply be seen as human, as worthy, as equal. Marcus exhaled slowly, reaching out to pull his son into his arms. "Because, Jaden, the world is big. And there are people out there who are going to judge you, not because of who you are, but because of the color of your skin. And that's not right. But we can't let that stop us. We can't let people like that take away our dignity. You have to stand tall, and you have to be proud of who you are. And when others try to tear you down, you show them your strength. We have to teach them better." Jaden nestled against his father, trying to take in the weight of his words. "But how, Dad? How do we teach them? I don't think they'll listen." Marcus paused, considering this. "You're right," he said quietly. "But sometimes, it's not about changing everyone all at once. It's about making sure the people who matter, the ones who are ready to listen, hear our voices. It's about standing up, every." "No," Marcus said firmly, his voice resolute. "We don't let them win. Not now, not ever." The next morning, Marcus sat at his desk, drafting a public statement to address what had happened with Emily. But as he typed, he felt the weight of the words shifting. This couldn't just be about Emily. This had to be about the larger issue at play, the systemic racism and prejudice that pervaded society. The fact that Jaden had to feel the weight of being other at such a young age was something that could no longer be ignored. The statement would have to be a call to action, a commitment to do better, to be better. And Marcus wasn't going to let this opportunity slip through his fingers. He called in his senior team, including legal and PR professionals, to help craft the message. Together, they brainstormed how to channel the incident into something that would have a far-reaching impact. It wasn't just about firing Emily, though that was necessary, it was about creating a lasting change within the airline, within society. The company would begin offering diversity and inclusion training to all employees, from the flight attendants to the highest-ranking executives. They would implement a zero-tolerance policy for any form of discrimination or hate, and they would use their platform to advocate for equality, both inside the company and out in the world. But Marcus knew that wouldn't be enough. The real change had to come from within, from the way society as a whole viewed race, power, and privilege. This was the point at which Jaden's experience, tragic as it was, would help shape something more important than just the airline's reputation. It would become part of a larger movement. Marcus decided to use his influence and his wealth to start a foundation for children of color, offering them scholarships, mentorship, and resources to help them succeed in a world that so often overlooked them. Jaden would be involved, Marcus vowed, as a spokesperson, as a leader, helping to show the world that the next generation could and would rise above the hate. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus watched his son slowly start to heal. Jaden, with his father's guidance, began to understand that the world didn't define him, he defined himself. And slowly, as Jaden took his first steps into the world of activism and leadership, Marcus knew they were on the path to something greater than either of them could have imagined. Jaden would grow up to be a man who would use his voice to dismantle the very prejudices that had once tried to break him. And as for Marcus, he would continue to fight not just for his son, but for the thousands of children like him, children who needed to know that their value was not determined by their skin color, their background, or their upbringing. Their worth was intrinsic, undeniable, and infinite. Together, they would prove that change was possible. Together, they would show the world that love, courage, and justice could, and would, win in the end. The ripple of change. As Marcus and Jaden embarked on their journey of healing and activism, the story of their encounter on the flight quickly became a topic of national conversation. News outlets, social media platforms, and online forums buzzed with reactions. Some applauded Marcus for his swift action and leadership, while others questioned the motivations behind his decision to go public. But through it all, Marcus held firm in his belief that this wasn't just about one incident, it was about changing the narrative around race, discrimination, and equality. As part of his commitment to creating real, lasting change, Marcus began speaking at various conferences and events, using his platform to raise awareness of the deep-rooted biases that plagued society. His public statements were raw, unapologetic, and profoundly personal. He spoke about how he had come to realize that even those with the best intentions, those who truly believed they were colorblind, still harbored unconscious prejudices that affected their actions. The media followed his every move. They documented his involvement with his foundation, capturing moments of Marcus and Jaden speaking together at schools, to children of all ages. Their mission was clear: to raise awareness, to foster empathy, and to challenge the harmful narratives that society perpetuated about people of color. And Jaden, despite his young age, became a beacon of strength and resilience. His voice was powerful, and as he began to share his story, he was met with support from people across the country, many of them children who, like him, had faced discrimination and isolation. But not all reactions were positive. There were those who questioned Jaden's authenticity, those who believed his father was pushing an agenda. Some dismissed his story as a product of oversensitivity, blaming the media for making a mountain out of a molehill. In the face of this opposition, Marcus didn't waver. He knew that the fight for justice was never easy, and that real change never came without resistance. But he was prepared for it. His son's well-being, his future, was worth the fight. Through it all, Marcus and Jaden learned that the fight for equality was never a straight path. There were setbacks. There were days when it felt as though the world was still stuck in its old ways. But there were also moments of profound progress. The ripple effect of their actions began to spread far beyond their initial sphere of influence. Other companies, seeing the success of Marcus's public push for systemic change, began to adopt their own diversity and inclusion policies. Schools took notice. Local communities rallied behind the idea of empathy and understanding, and soon, Jaden found himself invited to speak at events all over the country. One such event was a national conference for youth leaders, where young people from diverse backgrounds gathered to discuss issues of race, identity, and social justice. Jaden was a guest speaker, alongside activists, educators, and political leaders. For the first time, he stood before a room full of peers who understood his struggles, his pain, and his hopes for the future. The applause that followed his speech was not just for his eloquence, but for his bravery in speaking out. "I used to think I was alone," Jaden said, his voice trembling but steady, like no one else understood what it felt like to be looked at differently. "But now, I know that we all share this fight. And we have to stand together, because only then will we be able to break the cycle of hate." The room erupted in applause, and in that moment, Jaden felt something he had never felt before: the overwhelming power of community. There, in that room, he wasn't just a kid who had faced prejudice. He was a leader, a voice of hope, someone who had the power to inspire change. That same evening, Marcus sat in the back of the auditorium, watching his son speak with a mixture of pride and amazement. He had never imagined this moment would come so quickly, that Jaden, at such a young age, would take on the mantle of leadership. But it was happening, and Marcus knew they were on the right path. The success of the foundation grew, fueled by the momentum of Marcus's and Jaden's advocacy. They began collaborating with organizations that supported marginalized communities, offering scholarships to students who needed them most, and providing mentorship to young leaders who had the potential to make a real difference. Marcus made it clear that his commitment wasn't just to his son, but to every child who deserved to be seen, heard, and given the opportunity to succeed. But the impact didn't stop there. As the movement gained traction, more and more families began to speak out, sharing their own stories of discrimination, of bias, and of the struggle to overcome societal barriers. Marcus and Jaden had inadvertently become symbols of resilience and change, and they were leading a generation of children who no longer believed they had to accept the world as it was. They could shape it into something better. Meanwhile, Emily Carter, the flight attendant whose actions had started this entire chain of events, found herself under intense scrutiny. Though Marcus had chosen to remain silent on the matter of her personal consequences, the public outcry made it clear that there would be no easy resolution for her. Many people demanded that she face accountability for her actions, and while some called for her to be publicly shamed, Marcus remained focused on the broader issues at hand. He had no interest in creating a spectacle. What mattered to him was making sure that her behavior was addressed in a way that fostered real understanding, not just punishment. Eventually, Emily was given the opportunity to take part in a restorative justice program, a program designed to help individuals confront the harm they've caused, reflect on their actions, and understand the impact of their behavior on others. It wasn't about absolving her, but about creating space for growth and learning, something Marcus believed was vital to the process of real transformation. Emily's participation in the program made national headlines, but the conversation quickly shifted back to the systemic nature of prejudice, to the deeper work that needed to be done within institutions and communities. Marcus and Jaden used the opportunity to once again speak out about the importance of restorative practices, encouraging others to approach justice with a spirit of healing rather than retribution. It wasn't about getting even. It was about moving forward, together. As the months passed, Marcus began to see the fruits of his labor. More schools adopted anti-racism curricula. Corporations began integrating diversity as a central part of their business models. And, perhaps most importantly, the next generation of young people, like Jaden, started to rise up with a sense of purpose and pride. They no longer saw themselves as victims of a broken system. They saw themselves as the architects of a better future, one where equity and empathy were no longer optional, but essential. Marcus and Jaden had become more than a father and son, they had become a movement. Together, they stood not only as champions of change, but as living proof that the strength to challenge the world's injustices was within everyone, waiting to be unleashed. And in that moment, as Marcus looked at his son, now growing into a young man with the courage and wisdom far beyond his years, he knew the fight was far from over. But for the first time in his life, he felt hopeful, knowing that they were on the path to creating a world where people like Jaden wouldn't have to fight for their place in it. It would be a world that was already ready to embrace them, just as they were. The legacy of change. As the years passed, the movement Marcus and Jaden had started continued to grow, expanding far beyond the realm of racial justice and into every corner of society. The foundation that had once been a small project, born out of a single act of courage on a flight, had blossomed into an international initiative, influencing policies, raising awareness, and providing a platform for marginalized voices. Marcus and Jaden had no idea that their story would evolve into such a global force for change, but in their hearts, they knew it was only the beginning of a larger transformation. Jaden, now in his late teens, had become an influential public figure in his own right. As he stood before crowds of thousands, speaking about his personal journey and the lessons he had learned from his father, his words resonated in ways he had never anticipated. He was no longer just the boy who had been humiliated on a flight, he was a young man leading a movement, carrying the hopes and dreams of countless others who had experienced similar hardships. His speeches were filled with empathy, strength, and a vision for a future where everyone, regardless of their race, background, or identity, had an equal chance to thrive. Despite his newfound fame, Jayden remained grounded. He often spent time with the children who wrote to him, expressing how his story had inspired them to confront the prejudice they faced, whether in their schools, neighborhoods, or even in their own homes. These letters, these messages of support, were a constant reminder to Jayden of why he had started this journey in the first place, to give a voice to the voiceless, to break down the walls of hate that divided people, and to create a world that embraced diversity as its strength. For Marcus, watching his son evolve into a young leader was both a source of immense pride and a humbling experience. He often reflected on the early days of their advocacy, when they were simply two individuals trying to make sense of the injustice they had faced. Back then, the world felt overwhelming, and the obstacles seemed insurmountable. But now, as he stood beside Jayden, witnessing the power of their collective work, Marcus understood the truth: change never came overnight. It was a process, a journey of persistence, of confronting uncomfortable truths, and of taking action even when the world seemed resistant to change. One of the most significant milestones in their journey came when Marcus was invited to address the United Nations, delivering a keynote speech on the importance of global unity in the fight for equality. It was an overwhelming honor for Marcus, but he knew it was a message that needed to be heard on the world stage. He spoke about the importance of international solidarity in addressing systemic inequalities, emphasizing that racism was not just an American problem, it was a global issue that required collective action. In his speech, Marcus addressed not only the need for policy reforms, but also the necessity of shifting the cultural mindset. It is not enough to enact laws that say people of all races are equal, he said. True equality will only come when we shift the way we see each other, when we embrace our differences, and when we stop viewing people through the lens of their race, gender, or any other characteristic. We must start with empathy. We must start with understanding. And only then will we see the world change. His words struck a chord with many, resonating with people across continents. In the weeks following the speech, Marcus was invited to work with several global organizations focused on human rights and racial justice. He became a powerful voice in advocating for the rights of refugees, immigrants, and other marginalized groups, recognizing that the struggle for racial equality was part of a larger, interconnected battle for human dignity. Jayden, who had grown into a young adult with a deep understanding of the world's complexities, became increasingly involved in this global movement. His travels took him to countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where he met with youth activists who were working tirelessly to confront issues of inequality in their own communities. These experiences shaped his understanding of the broader struggle for justice, and he often spoke about how his journey had taught him that the fight for equality was not just about one person, one community, or one nation. It was a shared struggle, one that required the solidarity of people from all walks of life. Back home, Marcus and Jayden continued to lead their foundation, expanding its reach and impact. The programs they developed, which once focused on racial justice in the United States, now included global initiatives aimed at empowering youth, providing educational opportunities, and creating safe spaces for marginalized communities worldwide. Their foundation's work ranged from building schools in underserved regions to offering leadership programs for young people of color, helping to equip the next generation of leaders with the tools they needed to create lasting change. In the years that followed, Marcus and Jayden were invited to collaborate with tech companies, artists, educators, and activists who shared their vision for a more just world. The conversations they led around diversity and inclusion were no longer confined to boardrooms or political rallies. They had become part of the cultural fabric, influencing music, fashion, literature, and media. The message was simple: diversity was not just a buzzword, it was the future. The world was changing, and those who embraced this change would be the ones who thrived. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. As their influence grew, so did the opposition. There were those who sought to undermine their efforts, spreading misinformation and fueling division. But Marcus and Jayden remained undeterred. They knew that true change required perseverance, and they were determined to see their work through, no matter the obstacles in their path. One of the defining moments in their ongoing struggle came when they were invited to speak at a national summit on education reform. The event brought together educators, policymakers, and thought leaders to discuss how to ensure that every child, regardless of their background, had access to a high-quality education. Marcus and Jaden knew that education was the key to breaking the cycle of inequality. In their speech, they argued that education was not just about books and classrooms, it was about teaching children to see the world with empathy, to understand the value of diversity, and to challenge the biases that shaped their perceptions. "We cannot build a just society without first building a just education system," Marcus said, his voice firm with conviction. "It is the foundation upon which everything else is built. And if we want to break the cycle of inequality, we must start there. We must start with our children." The response to their speech was overwhelming. Within months, several states adopted new policies that focused on incorporating diversity training into teacher education, and many schools implemented programs aimed at combating implicit bias among students and staff. These small victories were significant steps forward, but Marcus and Jaden knew that there was still much work to be done. They remained committed to the long haul, knowing that real change was never linear, it required constant effort, reflection, and adaptation. As they looked back on their journey, Marcus and Jaden both felt a deep sense of fulfillment. They had witnessed the impact of their work firsthand, the way it had sparked conversations, ignited action, and inspired people to take a stand. But they also knew that their fight was far from over. The world was changing, yes. But the work to dismantle systems of inequality, to challenge ingrained biases, and to build a truly inclusive society was ongoing. And so, with unwavering determination, Marcus and Jaden continued their journey, knowing that they were not just creating a legacy for themselves, but for future generations who would inherit the work they had started. The story of their lives, of how a father and son, united by love and purpose, changed the world, was just one chapter in a much larger narrative, a narrative still unfolding, with no end in sight.